New Zealand's housing market is worth over $1.6 trillion, but is it all a Ponzi scheme, as some people claim? Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. I'm Ed, an economist and property investor here at Opus Partners. And when you see that house prices are 7.5 times what they were back in the 90s, and Bloomberg, very well-known business news organization, they call it one of the world's bubbliest housing markets, well, it's easy to see why some Kiwis think the housing market is rigged. But is it just one big Ponzi scheme, or is something else going on? Let's investigate. We've got to start by asking, what actually is a Ponzi scheme? And there is no better example than Bernie Madoff, that one-time American investment guru who turned into one of the most well-known fraudsters on the planet. And investors ended up losing $17.5 billion because of Bernie and his Ponzi scheme. Here's how the scheme worked. He'd collect money from investors and tell them that he'd invested it in stocks and other assets. But he wouldn't actually go and buy shares, properties, or other investments. No, not our Bernie. He'd just keep the cash and spend some of it himself. Then he'd go back to his investors, say that he was doing a great job, and he'd even get his team to create fake investment statements, kind of like the ones you get in the mail from the bank. He was trying to trick the investors into thinking they were making really solid investment returns. And I want you to put yourself in the shoes of those investors. If you get that letter in the mail, that email, and you think you're making all of this money, what do? You might say to yourself, this is great, I better not take my money out because he's doing such a good job making me money. All while Bernie is not making any investments at all, and he's secretly spending your cash. But what happens if an investor wants their money out? No trouble. Bernie would go and get new investors and use their cash to pay out the old ones. But then it all came to a head. We had the GFC and investors got nervous. They wanted their money out. And our mate Bernie, he had to come clean to his sons. They turned him in, and Bernie got sentenced to 150 years in prison. So what were the lessons? What were those classic signs of a Ponzi scheme? First of all, the Ponzi needed new investors to keep paying out old investors. On top of that, the money was never invested in actual assets, and the returns were fraudulent. They were made up by the person in charge. And here's the other important one. There was only one fund manager at the top controlling the whole operation. And if you're looking at that list, you might say, well, wait a second. The New Zealand housing market has some of those characteristics. Some people online will say, well, it's not even worth looking at housing anymore because any payments you make to the bank, that just goes to the previous owner's retirement fund or a new boat. And you might think, yeah, New Zealand's high house prices are reliant on new buyers and new investors coming in and paying out the old owner so that they can go take that money out and spend it on something else. And if I'm going to make money out of property too, then I need to find another buyer who's going to come in and pay me more for the house than I bought it for. Isn't that all a little bit like Bernie's Ponzi scheme where new investors were used to pay out the old ones? Well, that's the reason why some Kiwis say, look, if the New Zealand housing market isn't a Ponzi scheme, I don't know what is. And I really do get why some young Kiwis feel like the housing market is just a big wealth transfer from younger generations who take on mountains of debt to pay out older generations who bought those houses for way, way less. But we also need to be real with each other. Even though it feels unfair, that doesn't mean it is necessarily 100% a Ponzi scheme. And if you like this video, please do me a favor and click that like button. That's exactly how I know whether to do more videos like this or not. Subscribing, that helps too. We're well on our way to growing this community to 50,000 subscribers. Because if the only criteria for a Ponzi scheme is that new investors come in to pay out old investors, if that really is the only criteria, then every asset class is a Ponzi scheme. Whether you're talking about buying gold or shares or crypto or a house in any property market in the world, not just in New Zealand, if that is your only criteria. And to me, that mentality really understands the total fraud and suffering that real Ponzi schemes create. And that's why we've got to look at the other criteria that we talked about before, those characteristics of a true Ponzi. So let's come back to Bernie Madoff. He was taking people's money and not actually investing it. But if you buy a house, whether to live in or as an investment property, you know you own the property. You know you own a real asset. You can go through the council records and check that, yes, I am listed as the owner on the title. And if you buy that house and decide that you're going to live in it, well, you know that property really exists every time you wake up in the morning in your house that you've bought and have a mortgage for. If you've gone and bought a rental property, you can also see that the rent is coming into your account when your tenant pays the rent. It is a real asset. You can see, you can touch it, you can verify that it exists, and you can verify that you own it as well. So I kind of think when people call the New Zealand housing market a Ponzi scheme because it meets one of the criteria of being a Ponzi, I always think it's a bit like saying, well, a chair has 4 legs, this goat over here has 4 legs, so that goat is a chair. But just because the goat shares one characteristic with a chair, that doesn't mean that a goat is a chair. And if we come back to the property market, it's not just that you're buying a real asset that means, well, actually it's not a Ponzi. It's also that there are millions of people who can potentially buy and sell property in New Zealand. It's an open and fragmented market, whereas a Ponzi is controlled by one person who can cover up that fraud. And I really like that in New Zealand we can have a good conversation about this, both through this video and down in the comment section, because other people on the internet have said things like, it's abundantly clear you don't know what a Ponzi scheme is then if you think that the New Zealand housing market definitely is one. And these are two very different things, talking about a housing market that seems quite unfair and a genuine Ponzi scheme. But I really do get it that when some people call it a Ponzi scheme, they're not really saying, hey, I think this is literally a Ponzi scheme. Rather, they're trying to get across this deep sense of unfairness that they feel that perhaps they can never afford a house of their own. And the funny thing is today I have a podcast about how to become a first home buyer, invest in property and grow wealth through property. But I distinctly remember being asked to talk about property when I was the president of the Auckland Young Professionals, and I was like 22 at the time. And this PR company came to me and said, Ed, can we interview you on camera talking about property? And somewhere on somebody's hard drive up in Auckland at some PR agency, there is a video of me saying that I didn't think that I would ever buy a home and that a lot of people my age probably felt the same way. Now, 10 years later, I consider myself very lucky. Not only was I able to buy a house for me to live in, but I also own a couple of investment properties as well. And I say this because if you are feeling that way too, that you will never be able to buy a house, I really want to share 2 things that I've learned over the last 10 years, and some of them might be some pretty blunt or tough lessons. The first thing is, no matter how unfair something seems, you always need to ask yourself, well, what am I actually going to do about it? If I think about your job, let's say you really hate your boss and they're being really unfair to you. Well, something you can do about that is to then change jobs and say, I'm going to look for something better. When it comes to housing, it's a bit more difficult because you can't will house prices to come down. No one individual can control what house prices are. So the truth is we have to deal with the reality as it is rather than what we might like it to be. And the really good news in this is I am seeing Kiwi first home buyers make the most of a bit of a tough situation. For the first time in decades, first home buyers are buying more houses than people either moving house or investors who are taking out big mortgages. So I don't want to come across like the housing market's really easy. Oh, it's so easy to be a first home buyer. No, it's not. I know that it's tough. But that also brings me to my second big lesson, which is the way that you first get that first home. It might be different to what you initially thought. You know, back when I was 22, I probably thought that my first home was going to be one that I move in and I live in and I love it. Didn't quite work out that way because remember, I was up in Auckland where houses are more expensive. What actually happened was I bought a property down in Christchurch because it was cheaper and it was something I could afford. I ended up living in it for 6 months to make sure that my KiwiSaver withdrawal was kosher, and then I turned it into an investment property. And back when I was 22, I never thought it was going to be that way. But to confront the reality that I was faced with, which was I can't afford to buy a house in Auckland, I had to do it a different way and get my start in a different way. And even though the New Zealand housing market isn't a Ponzi scheme, we can have a really honest conversation, say, well, that doesn't mean that the housing market is easy either. The fact is, it's not. But we can ask ourselves, well, what am I going to do to respond to it, and how can I still make housing happen for me?